Hello, and welcome to the conclusion of the Men's Emotional Wellness Symposium. My name is Courtney Brame. I am your host for this event. Today, I'm here with Cam Fraser. We just talked to Jeremy Hurt from the Let's Talk Bruh podcast about Black masculinity. We talked about community and the importance of relationships with men, among men. We talked to Teddy the comedian, where he got to speak about his experience with suicide, creating an alter ego to be able to navigate those mental health challenges that he struggled with. We talked to Doc Digler about emotional intelligence, awareness, and how if you want to be with an emotionally intelligent man, ladies, you have to get through accountability. You got to be able to you got to be able to do that. You got to be able to manage being held accountable. And now today we got the Cam Fraser coming to us all the way from Australia, 5:30 in the morning, y'all. Cam, I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll just go into the conversation.
Sure thing, mate. Thanks for having me. Firstly, I'm very honored to be a part of this, and it's been really lovely to connect with you a little bit more over the last couple of days as well. Been following you online, and obviously we've chatted a few times, but it's been really great to just like reconnect with you, man. So my name is Cam. I am a men's sex coach. That is my professional title. But beyond that, I am a certified sexologist, a sexuality educator, and also the current deputy chair for the Society of Australian Sexologists. And this is very hush hush as well. It's not been 100% finalized, but I've just got a new role. My position is as a sexuality educator in high schools here in Australia as well. So that's going to be happening as of next week, but I can kind of start sharing that. And I'm really passionate about masculinity and sexuality. You know, I work with a lot of guys who are cisgender, heterosexual, and white as well, kind of who share my own lived experience. And I want to be mindful that that's like the lens through which I typically talk about sex and masculinity. There's, of course, sexuality and masculinity are not monoliths. So there's much more nuance to just being straight and white. But that's typically where I come from. That's my area of specialization. So yeah, I'm happy to speak into the depth of sexuality in the way that I can, but it's just something that's really always fascinated me is the intersection between having sex and being a man, and the resistances that guys have to pleasure and to exploring their body, and yeah, it's been a journey that's been informed by my own personal lived experience, from a lot of sexual dysfunctions in my early days to now I'm 30 years old. I've got a lovely wife, I've got a beautiful son, and yeah, I have a very different relationship with my body, with masculinity, with sexuality than I did 15 years ago. So yeah, I'm excited to see where this takes us today, man.
Yeah, man, thank you. And just so that everybody understands, like one of the reasons that I'm having Cam here is because he is one of the few men who I see as a sex educator who talks about men's pleasure. And I enjoy following your page, the Cam Fraser, online on Instagram. And I see some of the reaction videos that you have, and I like that you support what you say with research that's been done. And it's very easy to digest, and it's thought provoking in a way of like, I've never really had friends comfortable talking about sex, men friends comfortable talking about sex. And you and I spoke about having played sports and what the locker room conversations look like about sex. And I want to just really first start with that, right? There seems to be a way that we're supposed to talk about sex as men, and among men, let me say that, a way that we're supposed to talk about sex among men, among our peers, versus the way that we actually want to talk about sex with our peers. And you said, I got my notes right here, one of the things you said was about like in the locker room how we talked about sex. So I want you to just kind of speak to, from your own experience, like what was talking about sex like in the locker room among men versus what it can look like, and what some of the benefits would be to us being able and willing to communicate more about sex among men.
Sure. So I'll start with one of the things that I have said online, which has got me some of the most criticism, which is that I think men prioritize women's pleasure more than their own. And if I stop there, that sounds very controversial and also incorrect as well. I think if I stop at that statement, then that is incorrect. But I have a few caveats here that I want to expand on. So I think firstly, there's a difference between pleasure and gratification. I think that gratification is something that men are very good at when it comes to their sexual experiences, kind of scratching an itch, like quickly getting it over and done with, very surface level, just kind of no strings attached. And I'll speak more into that going forward. But that's how I'll kind of define gratification, is very surface level. Pleasure, on the other hand, is like deeply sensual, erotic, much more full-bodied. There's more depth to the experience of that sexual encounter. And so that's the first thing, is there is a difference between pleasure and gratification in my estimation. And then when I talk about prioritizing women's pleasure, I don't think that's necessarily always authentic or genuine pleasure that is being prioritized. I think it's sometimes performative. I think, we can consider how often women fake orgasms, for example. There's many reasons why. Partly it's because of the not wanting to bruise a partner's ego and not feeling comfortable enough or safe enough to speak up about the sexual experience that they're having, and asking for what it is that they want. So when it comes to like this idea of prioritizing women's pleasure over their own, I want to take those two considerations into that statement. And I want to offer an example here by way of talking about the locker room. So in the locker room, and I have been, and I'm talking about physical, literal locker rooms here. I've been in those locker rooms. I was a collegiate athlete in America for 5 years. I still play sports now and still find myself in various types of locker rooms. And one of the ways that I have observed sex being talked about in those spaces is it is a minimizing of those men's experiences and a emphasizing, and I would say like maybe even a bullshitting of the experiences that their female partners are having. For example, I'll often hear things like, yeah, I made her come so much, or I made her, there's a kind of taboo about making noise, right? So one of the phrases would be like, I made her moan so much, or I made her squeal so much. But there's this emphasizing of her experience or supposed experience, because half the time I think that maybe those guys are bullshitting and kind of thinking that they're God's gift to women, and so they're kind of aggrandizing their partner's sexual experience. And then there's the conversation when it does talk about his experience is usually just like, yeah, man, I busted the biggest nut, or yeah, bro, like I was, I came, whatever. Like it's very like surface level. So there's this emphasizing or exaggerating of her experience of pleasure, which again, I don't think is necessarily always authentic or actually really genuine. And then there's the minimizing or diminishing of his experience of pleasure in lieu of just like gratification. Yeah, bro, I just busted the biggest nut. And then to further that example as well, and I've tried this, so I can speak from firsthand experience. If you were in those locker room spaces, talking about sex among other men, and you started to talk about your own pleasure beyond gratification and started to talk about like how enjoyable the sex was for you, how intimate it felt, how sensual it was, how much you experienced pleasure across your body beyond just like you ejaculating, you'd get ostracized, you'd get bullied. And like, I know that because I have talked about pleasure and sexuality in that manner in these locker room spaces. And I've had guys in like a kind of self-defeating logical type of way go, what are you, gay, bro? Like, why are you talking about sex like that? I'm talking about sex in a way that feels good, heterosexual sex that feels good for me and my partner. And that rhetoric is seen as effeminate or seen as gay in the way that it's a derogatory sense. So that's what I mean by this prioritizing of women's pleasure over our own as men, but it's like a very performative way of thinking about it. And I think another example I can use here is pornography as well, like mainstream porn. We look at the way that female performers compared to male performers exhibit quote unquote pleasure on screen, right? So hopefully people have a reference point for this, but if you haven't seen mainstream porn for a little while, this is kind of typically what it looks like. got the female performer really exaggerating and writhing in pleasure and making a lot of noise and, you know, having these ecstatic kind of orgasmic experiences. Again, I'm not saying that's authentic or genuine, but that's what you see on screen. If you contrast that to the male performer in the scene, you don't see anything. Maybe you hear a little bit of grunting, but it's very mechanical. It's just kind of moving in and out, you know, like a machine. There's a great quote by Rocco Siffredi, who is known as the Italian stallion in the porn scene. And he talks about male performers just really being a prop. They're just a prop penis. And, you know, again, I don't want to use porn as a like example of like good sexual experiences, but a lot of people emulate, a lot of men typically emulate what they see in porn. And that is this expectation that women's pleasure has to look really you know, exaggerated and orgasmic, and men's pleasure is not really there. It's just about kind of moving in and out, thrusting away like a machine until you have that gratification piece of ejaculation, and then that's kind of it. So that's the discrepancies there that I see in like when we talk about pleasure. And then obviously there's a lot of nuance there to add about like the pleasure gap in terms of like who's actually experiencing real pleasure. And again, I think there's a difference there between gratification and pleasure. The orgasm gap as well, in terms of like how many women are orgasming reliably with their male sexual partners. So like there's more to that. But when I talk about men and male sexuality, that's often what I see. So I'm happy to leave it there and see if you've got any follow-ups to that, Courtney.
I do. The main follow-up is you spoke to this concept of like men doing what they think their women partners want them to be doing. And there's this book called No More Mr. Nice Guy by Dr. I think it's Robert Glover. And he speaks to that specific example with one of the case studies that he was talking to. And he told the person, he was like, hey, when you go home, like, have sex with your wife the way you want to, because he would go down on her all the time, and like she, you know, is not really into it, but they never had a conversation. And I think that what happened was uh he told her, or she said something to him, made him go and talk to somebody, and the conversation began or became that the sex got better when he did what he wanted to be doing, not what he thought she wanted him to be doing. And I think that what this speaks to is like this element of presence, that we're not in our heads and disconnected from our bodies doing what we've seen work, and I use air quotes when I say work, in porn as props. Because if we're doing what porn stars do, and what Rocco said is men are props in porn, we're not even there. These women are essentially like masturbating with a shell of a human that might do something unpredictable, but really what is more hot is just presence. So how can we get out of being performative men who are serving as props in sex and be more whole human beings present to the experience, and being able to experience and share pleasure, not pressure, with our partner?
Yeah, it's a great question, mate. And the reverse is also true a lot of the time as well. Like a lot of guys are because they try to divorce their emotions and their deeper felt like sensual experience from sex. A lot of guys kind of buy into this idea that sex is, you know, is surface level and is no strings attached. And in fact, it's one of the things that I would get clients come and say to me is like, I feel like there's more to sex, but I don't really know how to have that. Don't really know where to go or how to experience those deeper things. A very common experience I have with some of my male clients who are particularly a little bit younger is like, they'll say, I've had like this really beautiful sexual experience with this woman who's like done a lot of sexual work and she was amazing. And like, it was just this brief encounter. And now I don't know how to get back there, you know, and they kind of rely on women a lot of the time to take them deeper into their sexual experiences without knowing how to do that themselves. And so because of that, a lot of the times, you know, and I've heard this from a lot of women, is they feel like their male partner is just really just masturbating inside of them. They're just like a masturbation device, because a lot of guys aren't able to connect and go deeper with their presence and their, you know, sensuality and their eroticism in that moment. So the reverse is also true as well. But one of the things I think is important to speak to here, Courtney, and I've just lost my train of thought a little bit, so you might have to remind me what the question was. So please cut me off if I go in a complete different direction here. But one of the things that I wanted to share about is, No, I've lost it, man. Can you bring us back?
Yeah. So the thing that I was just bringing up was like not being a prop, and you spoke to the reverse of that being true, of not being present. And I was asking, how can men go from being performative to more present with their sexual partners?
Oh, sure. And I wanted to speak into an experience of like my own journey here. And this is a framework that I'll always recommend. I can't speak highly enough of it, but it's Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent framework. And for those that are unfamiliar, I definitely recommend checking it out. But I'll give you like a short story about my own experience because it speaks to what I think you were alluding to with that No More Mr. Nice Guy reference of just like kind of being at the mercy of expectations, I suppose, and not really unpacking our approach to sex and kind of going through the motions here. So I did this exercise as part of this 5-day professional training at Betty's workshop. And that exercise involved essentially asking your activity partner, we got paired up, asking your activity partner to touch you or do something with you in a way that they consented to, of course, but in a way that like was an authentic thing for me. What did I want? And the professional development was like learning how to ask for that. And so the scenario was I asked this woman who I was paired with, I said, hey, I just want to hold you. I just kind of want to spoon you. I want to be the big spoon, and I just want to hold you and spoon you and just like lie here on the ground together and not really do anything else. Is that okay? She was like, yeah, that's fine. I can do that. No worries. I consent to that. Hence the wheel of consent. And so we did that. And one of the instructors came over and they asked in that moment, they said, who is this for? And like, it was just a simple little inquiry, but it brought up this story for me. And I actually like started to tear up because the story that it brought up was I, as a man, all I wanted in that moment was just to spoon and to hug and to hold this person. But I realized that throughout my whole adolescence and early 20s, there had been sexual experiences where I had wanted that. I didn't want to have, penetrative sex. I didn't want to escalate to something that was like explicitly sexual. I had just wanted to hug and hold and be affectionate and intimate with my female partner at the time. But because I thought it was expected of me to continue to escalate and to elevate the sexual experience into penetration or into something explicit, I had bypassed what it is that I actually wanted and just gone through with sex in a way that I thought was expected of me because I was afraid that if I had just said, no, I actually don't want to have sex. I just want to hold you. I just want to be in this kind of space with you that doesn't involve penetration, it doesn't really involve sexual stimulation, that I would be thought of as less of a man. Or, and this is showing my kind of internalized homophobia at the time in my younger years. I thought, God, what if they think I'm gay? Or what do they think I'm, what if they think I'm less masculine or whatever it might be? So there had been times where I had disregarded and crossed my own boundaries when it came to the sexual experiences that I had, kind of going past where I was actually comfortable because I thought that was what was expected of me to do as a man. And that's what I thought she expected of me as well as a man. And she would think less of me if I didn't do that. And then I kind of had the realization, holy fuck, if I have crossed my own boundaries, then I have most likely crossed other people's boundaries as well. Because if I wasn't inquiring about what I feel comfortable with, then I definitely was inquiring about what my partners, my sexual partners felt comfortable with in those moments as well. So, the key to unlocking that whole scenario of like having sex the way you want to is to ask, and is to ask the question, who is this for as well? That's like the key central question in Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent framework is, who is this for? And if you're touching your partner, is it for them or is it for you? And neither is wrong, so long as there's an awareness around who is it for. If you're being sexual and doing this type of sexual stimulation to your partner, is it because you really enjoy it, or is it because they really enjoy it, or is it because you both really enjoy it? Like, asking that question can start to unlock the dynamics of touch and consent and communication as well. It helps you talk much more, I guess, like in a more nuanced way about sex as well. So I wanted to share that experience because I think it speaks to what it is that you were sharing there, Gordon.
This very much does. And I now have like a little bit of a deviation here because now what this brings up is more of like society's different ways of basically like stereotyping or stigmatizing men for not being a certain way. It's you're supposed to be this way. When we look at it from one end of the spectrum, it's men are supposed to be better. You're supposed to make a lot of money. You're supposed to provide for me. You're supposed to protect. You're supposed to do these things. And now in this space of consent that I would imagine is more sex positive and healthy, you're viewed as a man, you're questioned as a man who just wants to be cuddling. If this was your, let's say the instructor saw that you were the one making the ask and y'all are cuddling, them maybe it could have been perceived as just challenging you to be like, oh, is this really what you want? But it sounds to me like it could have been interpreted as that ain't really what you want. You're a man. Like you want to have sex with her, or that's what you want. You're just doing this because you think that's what she wants. And I just had that thought process of what else it could be. And I want to know, like, do you have any insight as to what it could have been? Or was this just your, the emotions that came up for you? Those are real. But later on in processing, did you think to yourself, oh, maybe that's not how she meant it? Or the
Yeah, I don't
instructor
think it
meant
was
it?
intended with malice at all. I think it
Okay.
was like, they're a facilitator. They did a good job of facilitating the 5 days, and so I reflect on and feel like it was coming from a place of inquiry and wanting to know. It wasn't a question that was only asked of me, so it definitely. I don't think anyway. I don't know who this person really is. I only met them that weekend, but yeah, my interpretation is that it didn't come from a place of malice.
Okay, good. Woo. All right. But yeah, I guess we can kind of go there a little bit further here because you did just want to cuddle, right? And how often do we see where men might use that as like an entry point into progressing towards sex because they don't know how to just flat out ask for sex. Is there anything that you have to say in regards to that? And just to make it more of a question, right? Like, how often do people give in a way that they think is going to lead to the outcome that they really want and not just flat out ask for it? And what are some of these, I know what some of the consequences are of like being angry or this turning into a potential assault situation or some kind of harm being done because this man may try and they want sex, they don't know how to ask for sex, so instead they ask, oh, can we hang out? Oh, can we just cuddle? I just want to come over and cuddle. Oh, I just want to let me see it. Just let me stick the head in, right? And then we get to that point. What do you have to say about that? I'm not sure that there's a real question there.
Yeah, well, I like to I like the phrase, is that a banana in your pocket or are you just happy to see me? Right. And a lot of guys, they have a fear of like being turned on and then expressing that turn on, particularly if they're, like I've seen this, especially if guys are afraid of, their like the expression of male sexuality, I suppose, like is what there's a fear around. And a lot of guys have taken on board this like male sexuality is predatory or is like we're violent, we're the aggressors. And I don't think there's an inherent violence to male sexuality, but of course the statistics do tell us that it's like typically men who are exhibiting sexual violence. So like I get why guys have kind of taken on board that messaging, and it's pretty prevalent in mainstream discourse around male sexuality and sexual violence. So I get guys come to me and they go, oh, I'm worried about crossing boundaries and like really overtly expressing my sexuality because I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. I don't want to be seen as that kind of creepy guy. I don't want to be seen as the dude who's like overtly interested in sex. And I'm the dude who's overtly interested in sex. That's my whole life, right? So I noticed that a lot for me, and my own experience kind of as a yoga teacher several years ago was I was hyper vigilant about not being seen as a guy who was interested in sex. I was very like, I'm not going to do any adjustments. I'm going to sit at the front of the class. I'm not going to, I was very contained with like my quote unquote sexual energy. And so I was very, like I said, hyper vigilant about that. And so I want to return back to that phrase: is that a banana in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me? A lot of guys go, no, it's just a banana. It's just a banana. I'm not happy. Like, it's just, and there's like a real aversion to actually authentically, genuinely talking about, no, I do find you really attractive. I do want to be sexual with you. I do want to, like, explore this with you. I'm interested in going further. And I think that's like, that is explicitly, and this is going a little bit off the rails, Courtney, so forgive me, but that's explicitly exploited by people in like the pickup artist scene, right? Who do talk about you needing to have sex and escalate and be sexual, but it's always from a place of like kind of manipulating women into the sexual scenarios by kind of, the agenda is always to have sex, but it's never like expressed, right? The agenda is always to kind of get your penis inside of a vagina at some point, but it's always like done surreptitiously through like, the pickup lines and the other, things that pickup artists will teach in order to eventually get you to that point. And I think, from my experience talking to women are able to pick up on that. Like, if a guy has this kind of underlying agenda, but hasn't really expressed it verbally or talked about it out loud, you can kind of tell if he just wants to have sex. If he's just trying to get to sex, there's an energy or a vibe to it, right? There's like an intuition of like, oh, this guy, he's not said it, but I kind of get the feeling that he just wants to fuck. And so, like that, so that's like definitely a real thing. And I think, what ties into this as well is, there's like a fear of communicating and talking about your desires. But also, one of the things that I notice is that for a lot of guys, there's only a couple of avenues for men to find intimacy in their lives, physical intimacy in their lives. And the two major avenues are sex and sport, in my opinion. So like I've said this before, and I stand by it, and because it was true for me, and I know it's true for a lot of other guys. But one of the reasons why men gravitate towards sport and locker rooms and the kind of brotherhood or camaraderie or mateship that's found in sporting context is because there's a lot of physical touch there and affection and male on male intimacy, in the sense of like, there's a lot of hugging, there's a lot of backslapping, there's a lot of butt slapping, there's a lot of like hands on shoulders and and huddling or cuddling even, and so that like fills a need that a lot of men have for touch and for intimacy and for closeness, which they don't really get with a lot of their male friends, or they don't really get in a lot of other contexts. You can see this when a lot of guys are drinking as well. Like, this is particularly true in Australia. Like, if you go out drinking at whatever time of the day, Australians drink kind of all the time, but typically if you're going out drinking at a club or a bar at nighttime, you will see groups of men, after they've had a lot to drink, start to be much more affectionate and close and touch one another, not sexual or erotic way, but just that closeness and that need that we have for touch. You can see as the inhibitions get dropped because of the alcohol, people start to do that much more in those male groups. And the only other real avenue for men, in kind of like a mainstream people who haven't done the work context, is sex. And then because there's all this kind of baggage around not being seen as less of a man, or not being seen as effeminate, or not being seen as gay, or whatever it might be, for not escalating that physical intimacy to a sexual encounter, a lot of guys, their avenue for intimacy and for touch in that moment is to just be explicitly sexual. When I think if a lot of guys were more tuned in and were more emotionally aware, as we're kind of talking about in this symposium, they'd be able to ask for the touch that they want, or the affection that they want, or like the intimacy that they want, rather than having to go through what they think maybe is expected of them to sex, or to something sexually explicit, when really they're just looking for some intimacy and some sort of avenue for closeness and physical touch, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And another thing that I've noticed is that it's safe to have your emotions in sports. Winning a game, excitement, happiness, fun, we won't use the word pleasure, and we'll talk about why soon, how pleasure is associated with femininity in this masculine context. uh After a loss or a big loss or being injured, even, right, you broke something, you can cry and it's okay. You can be angry, you can throw your helmet, you can get into a fight, and you're passionate. It's glorified anger in these settings. And I know this myself from having been a college athlete, or playing football from middle school all the way through college. And I've seen it, like, that's been safe. And you mentioned all these aspects of intimacy that, when sports are done, people don't tell you this. And this is actually really influential to the work that I want to also do, coming after this men's emotional wellness symposium, is that no one tells you how to get those needs met, or that they even are needs, when sports are done. When sports are done and you graduate, you get your degree, you don't go to the next level of sports, you kind of are just stuck there, expecting that the way that you've been doing life is just going to be the way that life is done, right? You've had coaches helping you, telling you what to do, when to be where you need to be. You've had teammates that you were accountable for. You had the locker room as a place that was safe to share your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, and say fucked up shit. You had your brotherhood, everyone's close and struggling with the same things. And you just had all of these things happening that were part of your identity for a really long time, and that intimacy. And then you go out into the workforce where you don't have any of that, right? You have a boss or a manager, you have coworkers, and it's a different kind of culture and environment. And again, like, you have this need that, if you're not aware of and attuned to what your needs are, especially emotionally, you're going to try and get these met in your relationships, in your career, in your friendships, in communities. And it may not be the healthiest way of attempting to get those needs met. So I thought that that was something that was worth bringing up and speaking to, because it speaks to that intimacy component, and, like, we don't know where to go to get it. And I think that this conversation kind of ties beautifully into looking at sex work, right? If men are looking for intimacy, I think people kind of demonize sex work and sex workers, without actually knowing, or understanding the clientele of sex workers as being men who are looking for something that, from these women that understand and may be able to offer that to them, uh, like, that the world is not willing or able to be empathetic with them about. Can you speak to what a man may get out of pursuing sex work, or if there's anything that you want to add on to what I just said too, because I spoke a lot and I wanted to make it kind of make sense for the transition.
No, I think you're very right there in saying that sporting contexts, in addition to the physical intimacy, are also one of the only avenues that men have for emotional intimacy as well. When I was a teenager, right? When I was a younger man, I remember the only instances of me crying were in sporting contexts. Losing, I was a rower, so losing a regatta, or scoring a goal, or I was a soccer player as well, so like defending and saving the team from losing that particular game. Like there's a lot of emotional charge that I remember in my adolescence, but the only time that I recall really having an outlet for that emotional charge was in sporting contexts. And so yeah, I think you're very right there as well. And then one of the, to transition this into a conversation about sex work. So I'm not a sex worker, but I've had a number of conversations with women who offer sex work with male clients. And every one of them, every sex worker that I've spoken to, and you can hear this on the podcast that I've done, is one of the things they'll share with me is, like, men come to see them for intimacy and for closeness and for, like, the emotional connection that comes from sex. I said before that I think men buy into this idea that sex is supposed to be devoid of emotion. I think that's a pretty strong message that we get from particular areas of the internet and male influences and things like that. But, like, talking to sex workers and talking to some of my male clients also see sex workers as well, the underlying reasons for them reaching out and engaging with that service is not because they just want to get their dick wet, so to speak. It's because there's a desire for intimacy and closeness and someone to talk to about sex, and to have their emotional, spiritual needs met even. And so you can hear sex workers talk about that. I've had several sex workers on the podcast say to me, I've had guys who come and we don't even have sex. We just talk. We touch and we cuddle and we talk, and it doesn't escalate to actual penetration or what you might consider like stereotypical sex. I'm not saying that's always the case. Those sex workers also say to me, oh, and there's those guys that come in, they just want to fuck and then they leave, right? So I don't want to say that's every single guy, but there is a portion of clients who go and see sex workers who aren't that stereotypical way that we think about men and male sexuality of just like only being penetration oriented, only just wham bam thank you man, or get it up, get it off, and then get out. I suppose there's much more complexity, I think, to male sexuality than we kind of like to think, and sex workers are kind of on the front line of that, and they have some really interesting and insightful perspectives about male sexuality that I think men can learn a lot from.
Yes, and the safety that comes from that, right? We look at intimacy, we look at safety and freedom. I'll put these two things on a spectrum, right? The more safe something is, probably the less freedom you have. The more freedom you have, the less safety you have. But it feels like with certain avenues, there are avenues where you can have these moments of both. You can have the freedom and safety. So there's this safety of, oh, okay, well, I'm with this sex worker, and I know that it's going to be anonymous. I know that whatever I say is safe here. She probably seen things that are way more fucked up than what I'm about to ask for or tell her, right? And then it gives you this freedom of being able to just share. And partially it could have these factors of, well, I'm paying her, so she's not going to be judgmental, kind of like you would a therapist, right? So we see like therapy work that's being done. We see like touch that's happening. And it, as a man now, having been in the sex education space, I've seen the value of sex work in such a much more wide range of ideas and what that looks like, compared to thinking that it's, oh, these women are doing what porn stars do. But it's like a healing component to it that men are actually like that. There's a need for there's a need for the ability to be able to communicate with a partner and ask for what it is that they need, and to be safe in being themselves without that fear of consequences later on down the road. And so I guess is there a way for men, if not sex work, to get into the practice of being able to communicate for themselves what their desires are, what their needs are, and to also, I guess, be able to assess if a partner's safe to be themselves?
Yeah, you're very correct in the sense that it is a judgment-free space for them to express their sexuality without someone thinking less of them for it. It's also one of the reasons why I think a lot of men are drawn towards pornography as well. It's because they can explore and express their sexuality in a way that isn't going to be judged by someone in that moment, right? It's a safe avenue for them. There's not a lot of and beyond that as well, there's like not a lot of, I would say this, I would say it as it is, there's not a lot of effort that needs to be put into like you exploring and expressing your sexuality when pornography is involved and you're doing it solo as well. You don't have all the context of another person and all the things they're bringing into the experience. You're not, paying for a service either for someone to hold that non-judgmental space. So like that, I see some similarities there between like the way that men use porn and the way that like men also see sex workers as well, is because there's a freedom there to explore their sexuality in a way that isn't going to be shamed or judged in that moment. And there's different reasons for both of those, but I think that that's why there's this gravitation towards those two spaces. One of the things that like you mentioned, Courtney, is like there's some therapy being done. There's some space holding that's being done. So men can go to therapy. That is an avenue for like learning how to communicate and be open and be expressive with your sexuality, with your emotions, learning how to have those types of conversations as well. You can see a sex therapist, you can see a counselor that specializes in sex and relationships. Like that is a thing that we can do as men. And I definitely think that more men should be going to therapy for this reason, is to like be able to articulate what it is that's alive for them around their sexuality, around their desires, around their sexual needs, and then their intimacy wants. So that's one thing that's going to help you discern then whether you feel safe in a context with another person. And if you don't feel safe, there's some communication skills that we need to start to work on, right? So learning how to ask for what it is from your partner that makes you feel safe. There's a lot of really great discourse happening around like how men can help their female partners feel safe. What I don't really see, which I'd love to see more of, is how can that be a mutually exclusive conversation, right? Well, not a mutually exclusive, but a mutually safety building conversation where, mutually beneficial. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. 5-6 o'clock in the morning, and some of those words are escaping me. It's a mutually beneficial conversation where that is a two-way street. You know, what can we do for both of us to feel safe in this context? Because I think there's a lot of stuff that men aren't disclosing in those sexual contexts, which are possibly making them feel a little bit unsafe. And you know, I'll talk to guys about listening to their dick. You know, their dick can be like a bit of a barometer for their feeling of safety. I'm of the opinion that a lot of the reason why men struggle to either get or maintain an erection is not because there's anything necessarily anatomically or physiologically wrong with them, but it's psychogenic, it's psychological, and there's like a sense of anxiety or not feeling, you know, safe enough, or, you know, feeling like they're not good enough or whatever it might be, which is contributing to their lack of getting and maintaining an erection. So that's and there's so many guys that are experiencing erection issues. So like that, what that tells me is, if my opinion is that a lot of that is psychological in nature, and there's stuff going on there emotionally that is not helping those guys feel safe enough to have an erection, or to feel like they can they can really show up in that sexual experience as present as they can. So listen to your dick. If you're you know, a guy, or if you're a person who likes to have sex with people that have a penis, like what's his penis telling you? You know, or what's your penis telling you? There's wisdom there to be had, and you know, a simple solution, I suppose, to that is giving yourself some space and some time for your body and your mind to sync up, right? The desire to want to be sexual, but the lack of erection is what's known as arousal non-concordance. And the simple solution to that is like giving yourself some space to slow down, to relax, to allow the body and the mind to sync up. And part of that looks like, you know, asking for like, hey, I need to slow down. I'm you know, I've got a lot of anxiety right now, or sometimes when we move quite fast, like maybe that makes me feel a little bit anxious. Right? If that's true for you, I know that's true for a lot of guys that I work with. Like they do kind of get a little bit of that performance anxiety, and then that kind of exacerbates, and they have a bit more of a catastrophizing that happens mentally. And so they shoot themselves in the foot, and they don't get an erection, and they feel like that's the end of the whole sexual experience. So if they can communicate to their sexual partner in that moment, hey, I just need to slow down. Sometimes I get a bit anxious because I'm quite excited. I think you're really attractive. I don't want to fuck this up. So can we just slow down for a moment? Can we just focus on making out or touching? Maybe I can go down on you for a little bit. And then after that little moment of relaxation and focusing on pleasure, they're able to get and maintain that erection and be much more present in the experience. But yeah, there's a communication skills element that goes into that as well.
Yeah. I want to expand a little bit on sex beyond just a penis or during moments of dysfunction. And then I want to go and transition into shame. So, for people who might be having moments of sexual dysfunction or wanting some sexual connection beyond, you know, their penis, like what happens if my penis doesn't get hard? What types of intimacy can I ask for that is still going to be pleasurable for me as well as a man or as a person with a penis?
Yeah, and if you don't have an answer to that question, if you're like listening to Courtney kind of prompt you to think about that as well, and you don't have an answer, one of the ways to start discovering that is through a self-pleasure practice, is by exploring the pleasure that is available to you, by giving yourself that opportunity to do that. A lot of the ways that men masturbate, and I speak to a lot of men about the way they masturbate, is very much just going through the motions, sitting in front of a computer screen, going to their favorite tube sites, and they're quite stagnant, they're quite stationary, they're sedentary, and there's not a lot of permission that they give themselves to explore their body, to explore what's available to them in terms of like their sensuality and eroticism and the experiences of pleasure that they're available that they're available to have. So like that's the first step, like to be able to like then ask for that from a partner and like explore the other ways that you're able to be sexual and experience pleasure together. It needs to come from a place of understanding your own body and knowing what it is that you find pleasurable. Beyond that as well, it's my son's just entered the room, so you can probably hear him. He's got a Buzz Lightyear toy. So beyond that, there's some decentering of the penis that needs to happen in your sexual experiences as well. Hey, Ferg, do you want to come say hello? Hey, do you want to come say hello? Okay, I'll get you a toy.
Said no.
He's like, no, fuck that. So like recognizing that sex doesn't have to equate to penis in a vagina, where you're able to, like I said, decenter the penis. This is known as phallocentrism. So taking away penetrative sex can be an interesting thing to do if you're in a committed relationship with your partner. Like, let's be sexual tonight. Let's have a date night where we're exploring, sexuality and being sexual with one another. That doesn't include penis in vagina sex. That doesn't include like even genital touch, and see what else is on the table for the two of you, right? Like you really diversify what's on what I'll call your erotic menu, right? When you're hungry, you choose from a menu what it is that you want to eat. But when you're horny, you choose from your erotic menu what it is that you want to satiate that desire. And for a lot of couples, there's only one dish on their erotic menu, and that's penetration, right? And that might be a great dish. It might be your favorite dish. But if you eat that same meal every single time that you're horny/hungry, right, it gets pretty boring, and it might not be what your partner wants in that moment. Maybe you're like really hungry for this big dish, but your partner only wants to nibble, right? And they're not actually as hungry as you. If you've only got one thing on your erotic menu, then there's going to be someone who's in those particular situations not having their needs met, and so adding more things to your erotic menu can be a great way to diversify your sexual experiences, but also to meet people's, like your partner's needs, your needs, when it is not specifically that dish that you want to eat, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does. Oh, that came out of nowhere. Yeah, that does make sense. And so what I'm hearing is mixing up even the way you masturbate. You don't have to sit in the chair in front of the computer screen like we are right now. Lying on your back. Like I think about how I've masturbated, and historically it's just been the same way, lying on my back. I mixed it up one time and like stood up and was like, whoa, this is exciting, right? But at the end of the day, we might just do what works for us, and that feels pleasurable, which is perfectly fine. But if you're wanting to, oh hey, hello, hi, it's like nah. But yeah, expand your portfolio, expand the menu. If you are aroused, if you're used to having sex one way, like maybe not think about it as the way we do with intercourse, where it's penis and vagina sex. There's other things that we can play around with, new positions. We can, the internet is a beautiful thing. We can access a ton of different resources for fun ideas and ways to spice things up. There's a whole world of kink where we can dabble into some of those resources that are out there as well. So I would like to touch on shame and then more about like pleasure. So here we've defined kind of how to expand pleasure outside of what we think sex is supposed to be or what pleasure is supposed to look like. Uh, we spoke on the phone or on our call about shame. And one of the things that comes to mind is like right after someone masturbates to some porn that they feel so guilty for watching, or even after seeing a sex worker, or after having a type of sex that's like taboo or that they're shameful of, right? That they go into this spiral of shame. Can you talk a little about what that is and why someone might do that?
Yeah, and something that I definitely want to bring up, because you touched on this earlier, Courtney, and we didn't have a proper conversation about it, was like one of the reasons why I think men have a lot of resistance to exploring their pleasure either solo or like start to really expand their pleasure when they're with a partner is because of what I believe the culturally coded message that we get about pleasure is that it is feminine. And one of the harken back to those examples that I used right at the beginning of this conversation. It's like one of the ways we can see that is through the way that pleasure is portrayed on screen, for example, whether it's pornography or whether it's mainstream movies and TV shows. It's the women that experiences the pleasure, guys experience gratification. When it comes to like self-pleasure as well, a lot of guys will not explore their body, or for example, God forbid, like he explores his prostate, which is where he can have prostate orgasms and experience a lot more full body pleasure that way, because it might mean something about his manhood or his masculinity, or his who he is as a man, right? Like there's this this culturally coded like femininity embedded into the experience of pleasure, and I kind of think like other pleasurable activities, like, and this is maybe showing my bias here, but like having a bubble bath and slowing down and maybe rubbing some like oil on my tired muscles and exploring my sensuality, and not being so explicit with my sexual exploration, like all the sensual erotic elements to my pleasure. For a long time I was like, oh, that was like, that was tough for me to do, because I was like, what does this mean about me as a man? Or like, isn't this what women do? Or there was like this fear in my exploration of my pleasure, and I think a lot of guys exhibit or experience a similar resistance to exploring pleasure because of the way that it's being culturally coded. So I wanted to throw that in there as well. And I've forgotten what your question was.
Just about like when men, well, you spoke to that pleasure component, but speaking to like men who maybe do a sex act and then experience like they go cry or they throw the phone, you know what I mean? Like because here's where I'm going with this, and I think that this is really important. We've talked about like how rushing and hiding was the word that you used when we spoke on the phone. You talked about like how men will rush it, get it over with, or go hide, like hide their kind of porn that they watch. And I see this shame not just as being something where they just avoid dealing with the emotions of, okay, I like this kind of porn, I like this kind of, sex. But I see it with violence towards trans women as well as maybe being a symptom of this. So the sexual shame of liking things that you quote shouldn't be liking can kind of spill into, okay, well, having sex with a trans woman and then getting done and being like, oh my God, what did I do? If somebody finds out, dot, 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 and then bam, violence is kind of what I'm thinking. Can you speak to that expression of shame so that I can be able to speak more to this, later on?
Yeah, sure. I think you're referencing a couple of videos that I've done recently about like that post ejaculation or post sexual kind of emotional experience that a lot of guys have. There's a term that gets thrown around by the likes of Joe Rogan and men that are in those spaces called post nut clarity, which is kind of like, it's an umbrella term. I think it does a disservice to what a lot of men actually experience after ejaculation, which, as you're describing, Courtney, is like some sense of guilt or some sense of discomfort or some sense of shame or some sense of like, sometimes it's regret, sometimes it's not necessarily regret in the sense of like, what have I done, but it's a sense of like, oh God, like I'm uncomfortable about my the emotional experience that I've had during that sexual encounter, whether it's solo or with another person, because a lot of guys aren't tuned in to their emotional experiences, and so there's some discordance there that happens with like the amount of emotions that they experience, the amount of intimacy they experienced, and then coming back to like their baseline after an ejaculation and them being uncomfortable with that. But there's research to suggest that there are a spectrum of experiences that men go through post ejaculation in that kind of refractory period. And again, this is my interpretation of that. Like, there's a softness after an ejaculation, right? There's a satiation that happens, and a diminishment in that sexual desire and that heat and that intensity. And I think in that softness, in that vulnerability, in that, even think about like anatomically, in that flaccidness and in that release, there is we might, like, let's talk about culturally coding things. That might be culturally coded as like a feminine space to be in, that tenderness, that softness post ejaculation. I think a lot of guys are uncomfortable with that post ejaculatory space because of that tenderness and that softness and that vulnerability that they find themselves in post ejaculation. So I really encourage guys, when they're both solo and partnered, to explore that space. After you've come, what do you notice? Do you notice? Again, I speak to a lot of guys about why they masturbate. A lot of guys just wipe up, get on with their day, and move on to the next kind of activity. They don't spend any time, holding their body, maybe placing a hand on the heart, a hand on the genitals, and just like breathing for a few moments and noticing what arises in them when they're in that refractory period or that post ejaculatory space. You can do that with a partner as well, like that post sex affection and cuddling and touching is like really important. It's really beneficial for like connecting with your partner. But again, I think a lot of guys have a reluctance to do that because of the fear that they have of it being like, effeminate or less manly or whatever it might be. So I think that fear, like a lot of aggression towards women and trans folks and gay men, for example, comes from a place of fear, comes from a place of disgust. I'm disgusted in myself for feeling that particular way, and so the avenue that I have for coping with that fear and that disgust and that that discomfort that I have is to lash out in a way that's going to make me feel more masculine again. And for a lot of guys, feeling masculine is tied to aggression, is tied to violence, is tied to that expression of power over someone else. That's a concept that Paul Kivel talks about, which is called the man box. Right? If you feel like you're outside of the box of what it means to be a man, one of the easiest ways in our culture for men to get back in that box and feel masculine again is to exert power over someone, is to bully, is to be violent, is to hurt someone, and is to express aggression towards someone so that you feel that there's that something that makes you feel masculine again, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I want to let everyone who's here know that we're at that Q&A portion. So if you have a question for Cam, I invite you to go ahead and write it into the chat. Cam, the last question that I have for you, and I mean, if nobody else writes in, we got 15 minutes and I can, make stuff up. But it's, does the kind of sex a man has or prefers say anything about him? And if so, like, what are some things that we can speculate?
I think that's a really interesting question. The first thought that comes to my mind is that it doesn't mean anything about you. And the reason why I say that is because I get a lot of guys who will be reluctant to explore like prostate stimulation and anal pleasure because they will like internally make it mean something about their identity and their sexuality. So like my initial response to your question, Courtney, is like, no, you can't tell anything about it. Like just because you like anal sex, that doesn't mean that you're a gay man. Like, anal sex isn't exclusively the domain of gay men, like for example. But then I kind of think, but the conversations I've had with like sex workers, for example, is like they can tell when a guy is, not very present and is not very emotionally, available, and who maybe is just trying to emulate what they see in porn. And so like there is maybe something that you can tell about the way that a person approaches sex, which is indicative of like their emotional awareness or their relationship with pleasure, for example, or their openness, their open-mindedness to explore more sexual experiences. So I think like there is maybe something to that. So I want to like offer both of those perspectives. And one of the things that I'll mention here is present. Like how present do you feel this person in front of you? Right? Is there a like, do you feel them emotionally? Do you feel them intimately? Or is there maybe a distance there that you're picking up on? Is there a lack of connection in terms of like how emotionally available they are in that moment? And I think like that's something that is a two-way street as well. You know, we can be present with our own experiences, and then we can I'll say like project that presence out into our partner as well. Like, do we notice if they're with us? Yeah, and this is something I'll teach men, is like, you know, being present with their own experiences, and then saying, hey, you know, I'm noticing that there's like there's something here. You know, like I'm being, you know, I'm aware of what's going on for me, but I'm also aware that like there's something, you know, there's something going on, you know, beyond me. Are you okay? Like, just using that as a prompt to like check in and maybe slow down and to stop and to have a bit more of a conversation. So you can project that presence outward as a person. Now, I teach this to men as a way of checking in to see if this other person is present with you as well, if that, you know, makes sense.
Yeah, man. I talked to Docs about that, the Brick City Buddha, shortly before you joined. And one of the things that we were talking about was how, like, with my partner, noticing something like a shift in their breathing patterns or a shift in whether or not they're moving or how they're communicating, right? And a lot of men may not be aware of that simply because they're out of touch with their bodies, right? Or they don't know, we're talking here about pleasure, we're talking about shame, we're talking about communication, and they may not feel, safe to stop and go, hey, are you okay? Because that in itself is associated with femininity and not masculine, and therefore shame may follow of, oh, what are you, not a man? Or what are you, some kind of a pu, you know what? Because you won't keep having sex with me. Why are you having this slow sex with me, right? You're supposed to rearrange my guts. And the guy not wanting that or presenting in a way that's like super masculine, like maybe tall, muscly, right? And a woman may look at him and go, oh, yeah, he's gonna like throw me up against the wall and do all these things. And that's kind of her expectation that isn't communicated to him, and he's like maybe wanting to be more gentle or have a different type of experience. And I know like the simple answer is we have to communicate, right? But uh there's there's a struggle, and there's like sort of a mutual responsibility for communicating desires. Do you have like any sort of tips for healthily communicating desires to partners?
Yeah, I think you're touching on something that's important to mention here, which is that everyone has expectations about men and male sexuality, not just men themselves. So what I mean by this is like our female partners, as you pointed out, Courtney, will have similar expectations and stereotypes about men because we all get the same sex education for the most part. And so one of the things that I'll encourage women to do, and I know there's women listening to this, is interrogate your assumptions about male sexuality and about the expectations that you might place on your male partners. And one of the things that is a simple prompt here to think about is if your partner said no to your sexual initiation, to your sexual advances. So if you're a woman and you're initiating sex with a guy and he says no, like what comes up for you in that moment? And several things might come up. Potentially it could be like, oh, maybe he's gay, you know, if he doesn't want to have sex, maybe he is gay, or, you know, oh, maybe like something's wrong with him because guys always want to have sex. Guys will always say yes to sex. They're always down to fuck, right? Like there's that expectation about male sexuality and libido. Or maybe you make it mean something about yourself. Or does he not find me attractive if he says no? Right? Is there something wrong with me? Does he not find me hot enough? Am I not, you know, attractive to him anymore? You know, we make that no kind of mean a lot, and where you go in your mind when like you kind of reflect on that scenario can be indicative of the type of stereotypes or stories that you tell yourself about men and male sexuality. So that's like a really interesting little thought experiment to do. But beyond that as well, and you know, it is cliche, Cordy, but like communication is key here. And so like having conversations beyond, and like I think it's really important to talk about sex like comprehensively, holistically here. A lot of people will confine their conversations about sex to sexual experiences themselves, but normalizing conversations about sex beyond just that sexual encounter is so valuable for destigmatizing and diffusing a lot of the shame and the expectations and the pressure that we feel about the sexual encounters that we have. So I encourage people to like have conversations about sex when they're having dinner, when they're having breakfast, you know, when there's, you know, modeling it for your children as well, like normalizing conversations about intimacy and sex in, you know, an age appropriate way for people that are around you. The little advice that I have here, particularly around like just having a conversation about sex, is do it whilst you're going for a walk or moving your body in some way. One of the things that is helpful for men, in my observation, is to help them get out of their head and into their feeling body, is to be moving their body, doing something active while they talk. And so going for a walk or going for, you know, swimming out in the ocean or just doing something where they're moving the body physically is very helpful for guys, in my observation, to get them out of their own way, to start actually talking a bit more openly about what it is that's going on for them, because they're not sitting there, the dreaded, we got to have a talk, it's kind of Hollywood scenario where you're like almost like being interrogated by someone across the dinner table. There's a lot of tension and pressure that people in general, but guys especially, feel in those moments. So like being able to have conversations when you're on the move and doing something can be very useful in that regard. When it comes to conversations about sex as well, oftentimes people in general will talk about sex when something is wrong. Like we need to have a conversation about this. We need to talk about sex because like it's not working, or like this thing's kind of happening. We need to fix this. And that can oftentimes lead to like tense, awkward, uncomfortable conversations about sex, which creates associations about like sex in general. And so I always encourage people to talk about sex when it's good as well. When, you can have a conversation about what it is that you enjoy, about like what feels good for you, about the sex that you had last week that felt really nice, and just like reaffirming that, it's like creating this beautiful golden thread between your sexual experiences by celebrating you and your partner and like the good sex that you enjoyed and the parts of it that you want to try again next time. Like those debriefing conversations that you can have about sex can also be really valuable and important and lighthearted and pleasure positive, right? There's so much like value in having conversation about sex that also include celebration, not just like there's a problem that we have to fix. And the last thing I'll say about having conversations about sex is we oftentimes, because we don't have them very often, try and have all of the conversations in one. So trying to chunk it out and say, hey, let's have a little conversation about porn. Let's have a little conversation about masturbation. Let's have a conversation over here about, this particular thing that we did on Friday night that I'd love to do some more of, that really did it for me. Like there's a lot to talk about sex, particularly if you're in a long-term relationship. And oftentimes I see couples try and have all of the conversations at once, when it can be helpful to just pull a couple of threads out and just have a conversation about that thing for the next 15, 20 minutes, and then put it to rest, and then choose the next thing that you want to have a conversation about, rather than trying to tackle everything all at once, if that helps.
Yes, it does. I think that was very, very useful information. I know we're at the end of our time. We got 5 minutes left. If anybody has a question, please ask it now or forever hold your peace. Cam, I want you to go ahead and take this opportunity to let people know how they can find you, how they can connect with you, and how they can see more of your work.
Yeah, I have a social media at the Cam Fraser across all social media platforms. I've got a podcast called Men, Sex, and Pleasure. And look, I'm open to receiving messages as well. I heard Doc say that he replies to all of his messages that he gets. I also do that as well. I get messages from people all the time. It used to really shock me that people would share such personal, intimate details with me via social media. But I quickly realized that it's because they don't have a lot of other places to talk about sex with someone who's going to hold that judgment-free zone for them. So very open to receiving messages if you want to share with me what's going on and seek some advice. I don't offer comprehensive coaching via Instagram Messenger, but I'm able to and happy to answer questions via Instagram Messenger if I'm able to, or at least point you in a direction that might be better suited for someone who could work with you, because I recognize I speak to a very specific lens around sexuality. But I'm just excited, man. I'm excited to have these conversations. I often find myself on podcasts which are hosted by women, and I'm like the first male guest to come on to talk about male sexuality, and I really appreciate it, and it's really something that I like to do. And then I see comments, I kind of get two responses. One response is like, thank you for having a guy talk about sex in a different way, and modeling what a different conversation around sex can look like for men. And then I also get other responses, which are like, why the fuck are guys talking about sex? Like, fucking, they've had their time. Like, who fucking cares, kind of. And so, like, I get it. I get the responses, and it's a charged topic to like really center men in the sexual experiences. But I really appreciate you kind of bringing me on to do that, man. It feels really, I just feel really humbled that you thought of me.
Yeah, man, this is needed. It's necessary work, especially considering so many of the issues that women I've spoken to have about their sex lives starts with men. And so just being able to have this kind of visibility and this messaging, this conversation be something that's put out there where people can see, oh, like guys can talk about sex, or oh, this is what it looks like. Oh, these are some things to consider. Because if we don't have the language, people are kind of left to try and fill in the gaps where our communication may be lacking. And when we do that, we tend to have to make a lot of assumptions, or we got to fill in pieces that are missing from the context of the communication. So I appreciate you putting yourself out there. I appreciate your consistency. And thank you so much for being part of this symposium. Like I said, I threw this together. Like, I'm surprised we were able to get this in the last day of Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Cam, thank you for getting up at 5:30 a.m. To have this conversation. And yeah, I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you as well, mate. And apologies for the distraction with my little son and for my lack of clarity at this time in the morning. Hopefully, it was still valuable for people that were tuning in.
Oh, absolutely, man. Don't worry about that. Like, I love that you were able to bring your kid. I mean, this is real. Like I said, like, this is important for me. I'd rather be real than like have a perfect, functioning podcast or whatever. So, thanks for your time. I'll let you get back to it, and we'll be in communication here shortly. All
Appreciate
right,
you,
y'all.
Courtney. See you,
Thank
mate.
you. All right, y'all. That was D. Cam Fraser from Australia. Came to us from Australia, y'all. So that was part 4 of the 4 presenters, speakers of the Men's Emotional Wellness Symposium. I hope that this was something useful to you all. I wanted it to be something different, and I believe we might have accomplished that. So thank y'all for sticking around. I will These are all recorded. I got to do some editing and chopping up. It'll be a minute before we can get these uploaded. So if you're here now, thank you for being here. And if you're listening to this later down the road, you'll see that this is somehow connected to SELF, Emotional Wellness Support Resources, Emotional Wellness for Men. This is a nonprofit organization that is currently pending paperwork as of June 30th at 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time. We're accepting donations to help us with getting things started. We got kind of some branding stuff done. We got a website that's under construction. Podcast is out. New season is going to be coming. The first portions of this is me just kind of like talking about my personal life and processing things emotionally from my therapy sessions, situations that were happening from the start of the pandemic through 2022, and just putting in action what it looks like to do the work out loud and on a podcast platform. So all of this is getting redug up so that we can start to do more of this. I like this symposium. I like these conversations. I want to have more of them, and I want for it to be useful not only to the people it's for, but to the people who love and support the people who it's for, right? So thank y'all. Thank y'all for supporting. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing this. And thank you to everybody who told somebody to be here. All right. I am gonna stick around and see if anybody has any questions. I see a lot of gratitude in the chat, how great this was. People appreciative, thank yous, and all the thanks. I appreciate y'all. All right, if y'all don't have any questions for me, I'm gonna go ahead and hop off of here. Thank you again. I will make these recordings available, and I will holler at y'all. Be on the lookout for more of this kind of stuff, and go to getselfed.org and give me your email address so that I can, once we get things up and running, I'll be able to send you how to access the recordings. and you'll be able to see what we're up to as a nonprofit. But I'm anticipating and envisioning yoga connections with therapists for men. I'm envisioning content that is not, what exists right now, something more real, but things to help men identify and create or use language to be able to speak to their emotions. Um, yeah, we'll see what else comes of it. But the podcast will continue to be a free resource, and I'll hopefully be able to get more conversations like this going. All right, y'all. Appreciate y'all. Y'all have a great rest of y'all night. Enjoy the last day of Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. I know there's Pride Month too. There was no like shade or anything like that. So yeah, if y'all going to do something for that, please enjoy yourselves, be safe. I'm gonna go and rest my voice, drink some water, and chill. Peace out, y'all.